A bigger ass like actor now. You amongst these people here. Go back to where you ought to be, now. There is absolutely no world in which you belong amongst these people here. Do you hear?
I see.
What is that supposed to mean?
You are either a liar, a scammer, or you are completely drunk right now, because there is absolutely no world in which you belong amongst these people here. Go back to where you ought to be. Now. The word now cracked through the first-class cabin of Swift Air's Flight SA 114 like a gunshot in a library. Miss Karen's finger was pointed directly at Fred Okafor's face. Her chest was heaving. Her voice had gone to that particular place where rage and certainty meet and produce something ugly. The place a person reaches when they have spent 11 years deciding who belongs in a room and have never once been told they were wrong. If you're ready to enjoy this story, I humbly request you like and click subscribe. Also let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now back to the story. Fred had not moved. Not a flinch. Not a blink. Not the smallest shift of his body that a person makes when someone screams in their face from 6 inches away. He sat in seat 1A, his seat on his aircraft, in the airline he had spent 20 years of his life building from nothing, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on Miss Karen with the total, unshakable stillness of a man who is not enduring the moment. He is waiting for it. His phone lay face down on the armrest. His water was untouched. His journal sat open on the tray table, pen clipped neatly to the page. 2 words circled twice in blue ink, protocol deviation. Around him, for phones were raised. 8 passengers sat frozen in their premium leather seats, watching. Nobody breathed too loudly. Miss Karen leaned in one final inch and dropped her voice to something quieter and considerably more dangerous. I have called the captain, she said, and when he gets here, you will not like what happens next. Fred looked at her. Then he looked at his watch. Then, unhurried, unbothered, with the energy of a man who has already seen the last page of the book, he uncapped his pen, turned to a fresh line in his journal, and wrote something new beneath the circled words. He underlined it twice. He capped his pen. He folded his hands again. He waited, because in 14 minutes his attorney was going to send one message to his phone. And in 15 minutes, everything Miss Karen believed about this afternoon, this seat, this aircraft, this man she had just screamed at in front of 4 cameras, was going to come apart at the seams. From the jet bridge, the sound of heavy boots announced that Captain Guston had arrived. Fred Okafor exhaled slowly. Fred had started doing passenger audits 15 months after the Swift Air's board approved their regional expansion. The idea had come to him at 3 in the morning, the way his best ideas always did, suddenly, quietly, arriving fully formed like a document someone had slid under the door of his mind. He had built Swift Airs from a 2-plane regional operation running cargo between Chicago and California into a nationally recognized American carrier with 47 routes and a fleet that was the envy of 3 larger competitors. He had done it by understanding, with absolute precision, the distance between what a company claimed to be and what it actually was when no one important was watching. So Fred Okafor watched. Personally, he had boarded his own airline 14 times in 3 years without identifying himself, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying a standard boarding pass purchased through the public website, sitting in whatever cabin his reservation placed him and observing everything. The speed of beverage service, the tone of the safety announcements, the way crew members looked at passengers when they thought no one of consequence was looking back. He kept notes in a black leather journal with the Swift Air's logo embossed on the cover, which he found quietly satisfying, and he filed those notes in a personal folder that had already resulted in 2 service protocol overhauls and 1 regional manager reassignment. This was his 15th audit. Flight SA 114, departing at 2:15 p.m., bound for California, full first-class cabin, routine operating conditions. Fred had specifically chosen a first-class seat for this audit because the most recent internal survey data showed a 12% satisfaction dip among premium cabin passengers over the past 2 quarters. He wanted to understand why. He arrived at the gate in a vintage Beatles t-shirt, faded black, John, Paul, George, and Ringo pressed in faded white across the chest, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. His carry-on was a simple black duffel. He had left the Audemars at home and wore a plain watch, nothing that announced a thing about him. This was intentional. This was the point. He wanted the experience that every passenger received, unfiltered by the reflex of recognition. He scanned the terminal as he walked, the professional habit of 20 years activating automatically. Gate 4 had a service delay. A family of 4 standing at the desk, confused, the agent scrolling through a screen with the particular body language of someone who had already decided the problem was unsolvable before she began. Fred made a mental note. Gate 9 smelled faintly of the cleaning compound the overnight crew used, which meant the afternoon ventilation cycle hadn't run. Another note. He reached Gate 7, joined the first-class boarding queue, and when his zone was called, he walked down the jet bridge with his duffel on one shoulder and his boarding pass on his phone screen. He settled into seat 1A. The leather was the right temperature. The ambient lighting was correct. A copy of the California Business Review had been placed on the seat, a nice touch that the previous protocol review had recommended. Fred picked it up, noted the placement, and set it on the tray table. He ordered still water from the first crew member who passed. He opened his journal. He intended to make this a quiet, productive 2 hours in the air. He was still writing his first note when he heard a voice above him. "Sir." The word was crisp and coded in a particular kind of professional courtesy that Fred had learned, over many years, was the thinnest possible shellac over something else entirely. He looked up. The flight attendant standing in the aisle beside seat 1A was a woman in her mid-40s, blonde hair pulled into a precise knot, for gold stripes on her epaulets, a silver name tag that read Karen M. She was holding a tablet in one hand and looking at Fred with an expression that she had almost but not quite managed to make neutral. "Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Fred set his pen down. "You scanned it at the gate," he said. He said it pleasantly, factually, with no edge whatsoever. "I need to verify it again," Karen said. "We've had some issues with." She paused, and the pause was its own sentence. "Irregular tickets in this cabin." Fred unlocked his phone and held up the boarding pass. Karen looked at it for a moment, then asked for a second form of identification. Fred noted, in the precise, cataloging corner of his mind that never fully went off duty, that she had not asked the man in seat 1B for any identification at all. He noted that the man in seat 1B was white, wore a suit, and had been poured a glass of champagne 90 seconds after boarding. He noted these things the way a scientist notes conditions in an experiment, without immediate judgment, without emotional charge, with only the clean, clear-eyed recognition that data was being collected. He handed Karen his driver's license. She studied it for a moment that was precisely 3 seconds longer than any verification required. Then she handed it back, told him she would need to confirm the ticket status at the boarding desk, and walked toward the galley with the particular pace of someone who has made a decision they are not yet ready to announce. The woman in seat 3A raised her phone. Fred picked up his pen and wrote 2 words in his journal, protocol deviation. Then he circled them. Twice. Karen returned from the galley 4 minutes later. In those 4 minutes, the remaining first-class passengers had boarded, the cabin had filled, and the energy in those front rows had begun to develop the particular quality of ambient attention that Fred recognized as the precursor to a scene. People were pretending to look at their phones. They were not looking at their phones. Karen did not return with a resolution. She returned with a posture. She planted herself in the aisle beside seat 1A, turned to face Fred with her chin slightly elevated, and said, at a volume that made the word quietly completely inapplicable, "Sir, your ticket has flagged as irregular in our system. I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and exit the aircraft while we resolve this." Fred looked at her. He said nothing. "This is not a request," Karen said, and she raised one finger and pointed it, leveled at his face like something she had practiced, like something that had always worked before. "I need you to get up. Now." The cabin was completely still. Fred placed his journal deliberately on the tray table. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at Karen's finger, then at Karen's face, and he said, in a voice so calm it almost had a color, something like the gray-blue before a storm settles in. My ticket is valid. My seat is reserved. I'm not going anywhere. Karen's jaw tightened. She had been in first class for 11 years. Nobody had ever just looked at her like that. Not with aggression, not with panic, but with the steady, unimpressed patience of a man who had already calculated exactly how this would end and found the ending entirely acceptable. It unnerved her in a way she would not, even weeks later in a deposition, be able to fully articulate. She reached for the intercom phone on the cabin wall. She said 2 words into it, words that had never before been necessary on any of Fred Okafor's 14 previous audits. Get Gustin. Fred checked his watch. He reached for his phone. He dialed his attorney. David, he said, when the call connected after half a ring. Are we ready? A pause. He listened. Then, give me 10 more minutes. He set the phone face down on his knee. He waited. Captain Gustin arrived the way men who have never been questioned arrive, with complete certainty of outcome and all the theater that certainty permits. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders in the way that 27 years of authority tends to distribute itself physically, as though the weight of institutional power gradually reconfigures the body that carries it. He had the bearing of a man who had removed difficult passengers from aircraft before and found the experience, on some level that he would never say aloud, satisfying. He walked the length of the first-class aisle without looking at any of the other passengers, a tunnel vision that Fred noted was itself a kind of answer to the question of what kind of pilot this man was. He stopped at seat 1A. He placed one hand on the top of the headrest, directly above Fred's head, a gesture so precisely calibrated to communicate physical dominance that it was almost academic, and he leaned down until his face was close enough that Fred could read the stitching on his captain's wings. I've been flying for 27 years, Gustin said, keeping his voice low in the particular way that public threats are delivered when the person making them wants plausible deniability. In 27 years, I have never had a situation on my aircraft that I could not resolve in under 2 minutes. You're going to be my first. He let the question sit for exactly 1 beat. Son, I am giving you 1 opportunity to stand up and walk off this plane voluntarily, before I make a call to ground security that will not be pleasant for either of us. But it will be considerably less pleasant for you. Fred looked up at him. Not up the way a person looks up when they are intimidated, not with a craned neck and wide eyes, but up the way a man looks up from his desk when an interruption has arrived that he has already decided does not merit standing. Measured, unhurried, privately, and deeply unimpressed. Captain, Fred said, and the word was perfectly respectful, perfectly level, carrying not a trace of the anger that every person in that cabin, watching, recording, barely breathing, expected it to carry. Are you aware of who owns this aircraft? Gustin blinked. It was a small blink, involuntary, the kind that happens when a question arrives from a direction the brain hadn't accounted for. The Swift Airs Corporation owns this aircraft, he said, and I am the commanding officer of this flight, which means... Correct, Fred said. The Swift Airs Corporation. He reached into his jacket pocket. He did not pull out ID. He pulled out his phone and, holding Gustin's gaze, placed a single call. David, I need 7 more minutes. Make sure everything is time-stamped. He ended the call. He set the phone back on his knee. He looked at Gustin. I'll let you know when I'm ready to continue our conversation. Gustin stared at him for a moment that stretched past comfortable and into somewhere nobody in that cabin had expected the afternoon to go. Then he straightened up, jaw set, and said, Get ground security on the line, to Karen, who was already reaching for the phone. Fred turned to look out the window at the tarmac. He was thinking about a letter he needed to write. He was thinking about the service protocol overhaul this flight was going to generate. He was thinking, with the particular detached clarity that came from having been tested this way before. Tested by boardrooms, by banks, by every room that had ever looked at him, and decided, before he opened his mouth, that he was in the wrong place, that the most expensive mistake a person could make was to assume that the measure of a man was the label on his shirt. He was thinking all of this very calmly when his phone vibrated. Once, he looked at the screen. A message from David Allade, his corporate attorney, timestamped 2:47 p.m. Majority shareholder documentation notarized and filed with the Swift Airs Board Registry. Board Chairman authorization confirmed. You're clear, Mr. Okafor. Fred read the message twice. He set the phone on the armrest. He exhaled. Not with relief, not with triumph, but with the quiet, focused exhale of a man who has been waiting at a starting line and has just heard the gun. He buttoned the top button of his jeans jacket. He stood up. The cabin had the particular quality of silence that only happens when a large group of people simultaneously realize they are watching something they will describe for the rest of their lives. Fred stood in the aisle of his own aircraft, in his Beatles t-shirt and his clean white sneakers, and for the first time in 15 minutes he turned to face both Karen and Guston together. Not with aggression, not with theater, but with the absolute, unperformative calm of a man who is standing on ground that has always been his and has simply been waiting for the right moment to say so. When Fred spoke, he spoke at a volume that filled the cabin without effort. The natural projection of a man who has addressed boardrooms and shareholders and regulatory bodies and never once needed to raise his voice to be heard in full. My name is Frederick Okafor, he said. I am the founder of Swift Airs. I am the majority shareholder of Swift Airs. I hold 51% of the outstanding shares of the Swift Airs Corporation, and I serve as chairman of the board of directors. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, the one pocket that had not been visible during the entire 15 minutes, and produced a slim leather card holder. He opened it and held it out. The chairman's credentials, embossed gold on black, the board registry number printed beneath his name. Beneath that, on his phone screen which he held up with his other hand, was the notarized shareholder documentation that David had filed 6 minutes ago, time-stamped and board-certified. He held both items steady, and he let the silence do what it needed to do. Guston's face underwent a change that was difficult to watch even for the people who had been recording the confrontation and were rooting for exactly this moment. The color drained from his neck first, then rose in his cheeks, then drained again, leaving him with the particular complexion of a man who has just understood, in a single flooding instant, the full scope of what he has done. His hand, still resting on the headrest of seat 1A, came slowly down to his side. Karen's raised finger, the finger that had been pointed at Fred's face for the better part of 15 minutes, the finger that had featured prominently in 4 separate phone recordings from 4 separate angles, dropped to her side so abruptly it looked almost physically involuntary, like a puppet whose string had been cut. The woman in seat 3A, who had been recording continuously for 11 minutes and had, without knowing it, just captured what would become one of the most viewed aviation videos in the history of the internet, let out a breath that was not quite a word but communicated everything a word could. Fred did not look at any of the passengers. He was not performing for them. He was not enjoying this. His expression was the expression of a man doing a job that needed to be done, precise, purposeful, and entirely without malice. Captain Guston, he said, and he put his phone to his ear without breaking eye contact with the man in front of him. The call connected in under 2 seconds, because when the chairman of Swift Airs calls the operations tower on a direct line, it connects in under 2 seconds. This is Frederick Okafor, Chairman, Swift Airs. I'm calling from the first-class cabin of Flight SA-114. I am issuing a grounding order, effective immediately, pending a crew review. Please confirm. A pause. Then, from the phone speaker, audible to the first 3 rows. Confirmed, Mr. Okafor. Flight SA-114 is grounded. Do you need ground coordination? Fred said, yes. Send the senior gate agent to the jet bridge and notify the duty officer. He ended the call. The mechanical thud of the jet bridge reattaching to the aircraft moved through the cabin like a gavel coming down on a bench. Guston tried to speak. He said, "Now listen." And Fred turned to look at him with an expression so calm and so complete that the sentence simply stopped, the way a fire stops when the oxygen is removed. "No, Captain," Fred said quietly. "I think you've said enough for today." Fred walked up the aisle toward the forward door, and the cabin remained absolutely still in the way that rooms stay still after something seismic has passed through them. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of recalibration, of people trying to locate themselves in a story that had just changed shape entirely. The senior gate agent, a young man named Tobias, 23 years old, 7 months into the job, who would later tell his mother that he had not fully believed what he was witnessing until he saw the chairman's credentials with his own eyes, appeared at the jet bridge door with the swift, controlled professionalism of someone who had been briefed enough to know the situation was serious and not enough to know exactly how serious. Fred stepped onto the jet bridge. He turned and waited. Guston and Karen, flanked by 2 ground crew members who had arrived with the gate agent, stepped off the aircraft behind him. The jet bridge door closed. Fred looked at them both for a moment. Guston had composed himself into something resembling his original authority, the way a man instinctively straightens his jacket when he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. Karen was very still, her professional mask back in place, though her eyes had a quality that Fred recognized. The look of someone who has just understood that the story they have been telling themselves about themselves may require significant revision. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He spoke to them the way he wished, in a different world. This entire conversation could have gone from the beginning, directly, clearly, without cruelty, without theater, and without the pretense that what had happened was anything other than exactly what it was. "Captain Guston," he said, "you've served this airline for 27 years. You have 3 commendations in your service file. You have an exceptional safety record." He paused. "Which means you knew better than anyone on that aircraft what the standard of conduct was. You knew what this company stands for. You chose something different today. You chose to use 27 years of institutional authority to intimidate a passenger who had done absolutely nothing except sit in a seat he had every legal right to occupy." Another pause. "That's not an error in judgment. That's a character decision. And character decisions have consequences." He produced 2 envelopes from the interior pocket of his jacket, the same pocket that had held his chairman's credentials, a pocket that Fred had packed this morning with the focused intentionality of a man who had learned, in 20 years of building things, that preparation is not pessimism. It is precision. He had carried these envelopes because he had conducted 14 previous audits and had understood, with the particular foresight of someone who has spent his life reading the distance between what organizations claim to be and what they actually are, that one day an audit would become something else. Today was that day. He held out the first envelope to Guston and the second to Karen. They took them, Guston slowly, Karen with hands that were not entirely steady. "Those are your formal termination notices," Fred said, "prepared and time-stamped by the Swift Air's Human Resources System on the authorization of the board chairman. Your union representatives will be notified within the hour. You are both entitled to the full appeals process, and I encourage you to use it. The documentation from today's incident, including the cabin crew's incident report, the boarding records, and the recordings made by passengers, will be preserved and submitted in full." He looked at them both for one more moment, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with the quiet solemnity of a man who understands that the correction of a wrong is not a celebration. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said, and he meant it with a completeness that neither of them, in that moment, was entirely equipped to receive. He turned to Tobias. "Please coordinate a replacement crew with dispatch. I'd like to give the passengers an updated departure time as soon as possible. And Tobias, make sure they're offered a full service reset. Fresh drinks, hot towels, whatever the galley has. They've had an uncomfortable afternoon. Let's fix that." Tobias, who had not spoken a word since arriving at the jet bridge, said, "Yes, sir." He said it in the voice of someone who has just learned something he will carry for a long time. Fred walked back through the jet bridge door and into his aircraft. The cabin had not returned to normal in the time Fred had been on the jet bridge. It had instead developed the specific atmosphere of a space in which people are trying to pretend they are not doing what they are very clearly doing, which was waiting with every available cell of their attention for whatever happened next. Phones that had been lowered were not fully lowered. Conversations that had started were not fully started. When Fred came through the forward door, there was a collective, almost held breath that would have been almost funny under different circumstances. Fred walked back to seat 1A. He sat down. He picked up his journal from the tray table where he had set it. His pen still clipped to the open page. The words protocol deviation circled twice in the blue ink he always used, and he turned to a fresh page. He wrote the date. He wrote the flight number. He began to write. He was on his third line when the woman in seat 2A, who had not been there at the beginning of the confrontation, who had boarded late and taken her seat during the standoff, and had therefore witnessed the latter half of it with the vivid, disorienting clarity of someone who has stepped into a film already playing, leaned across the armrest and said, in a voice pitched very low, "That was remarkable." Fred looked up. She was a woman in her early 50s, silver-streaked hair, the kind of purposeful composure that spoke of a professional life spent in rooms where composure was required. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite sympathy, but something more considered than either. "It was necessary," Fred said. "Yes," she said. "I imagine it's had to be necessary more than once." Fred looked at her for a moment. He thought of the 14 previous audits. He thought of the boards and the banks and every room that had taken one look at him and reached for a conclusion that had nothing to do with his work. He thought of what it had cost him, across 20 years, to respond to those rooms not with rage and not with retreat, but with the patient, methodical accumulation of proof. Proof that he was exactly who he said he was, proof that could not be argued with or explained away. Proof that lived in shareholder registries and board certifications and the bottom lines of companies that would not have existed without him. "Yes," he said. "More than once." She nodded. She offered her hand. He shook it. She did not ask him anything else, and he found that he was grateful for that, in the way a man is grateful for a silence that knows its own value. He turned back to his journal. He wrote for another 4 minutes, until Tobias appeared at the forward door and announced, with a professionalism that had clearly been activated by the afternoon's events, that a replacement crew would be boarding within 30 minutes and that all first-class passengers were invited to a full-service reset. There was a ripple of response through the cabin. Not quite applause, not quite relief, but something warm and collective that sounded, to Fred's ear, like the specific exhale of a room that has been holding its breath and has been given permission to stop. He capped his pen. He closed his journal. He looked out the window at the tarmac, where a ground crew was already moving around the aircraft with the focused efficiency of people who have been given clear instructions and the authority to carry them out. And for the first time since the boarding pass scanner had beeped at Gate 7 that afternoon, he permitted himself something very close to rest. Not satisfaction. That would come later and tempered, as it always was, by the knowledge that the existence of this story meant the problem was real and ongoing. Not triumph. There was nothing to triumph over except a failure that should not have been necessary to correct. But rest. The particular stillness that comes after a thing has been done that needed doing, done the right way, with the right tools at the right time. His phone buzzed. David again. Board has been notified. Full statement being prepared. Press inquiries already coming in. Do you want us to respond or wait for your instruction? Fred typed back, "Wait for my instruction." He paused. Then he added, "I have some thinking to do first." He put the phone in his jacket pocket. He looked out at the California sun slanting off the tarmac in flat gold plains. He thought about what David would say when Fred told him what he was already beginning to formulate. Not a press statement, not a legal action, but something larger, something with architecture and intention, something designed not just to correct what had happened today, but to make it structurally harder for today to happen tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after that. He was still thinking about it when the replacement crew boarded. 3 of them, efficient and warm, greeting each first-class passenger by name from the manifest, setting the cabin back to rights with a speed and grace that told Fred exactly what the afternoon's disruption had cost his passengers and exactly how much ground needed to be made up. The woman in seat 2A was poured a glass of champagne. She raised it, very slightly, in Fred's direction. He raised his water glass in return. Flight SA 114 departed for California 41 minutes late. It landed without incident. Fred Okafor spent the flight writing. The video, 4 minutes and 17 seconds of it, shot from the 3rd row of the first-class cabin on a phone with an unexpectedly good stabilizer, was uploaded before the replacement crew had finished their beverage service. By the time the wheels of Flight SA 114 touched down in California, it had been viewed 2 million times. By the following morning, it was 27 million. By the end of the week, it had crossed 340 million views across 17 platforms in 32 countries, and its most replayed segment, the 11 seconds in which Fred Okafor stands in the aisle of his own aircraft in a Beatles t-shirt, produces his chairman's credentials, and says, "I am the founder of Swift Airs," in a voice of such absolute, unperformable calm that it sounds less like a declaration and more like a natural law being read aloud, had been clipped and reshared so many times that the number ceased to be meaningful. The response was, in the way of these things, simultaneously overwhelming and entirely predictable. Corporate accountability advocates cited the video in congressional testimony. Aviation industry analysts dissected it on cable news. Legal scholars examined the employment terminations with the specific fascination of people who spend their careers wondering what would happen if a majority shareholder ever actually showed up. Late-night comedians did their pieces. Editorial boards wrote their columns. Social media generated its opinions in the industrial quantities that social media generates opinions about everything, roughly divided between people who understood immediately what they were watching and people who required several days and a great deal of additional information to arrive at the same understanding. Swift Air's board held an emergency session within 24 hours, which Fred attended via video call from his hotel in California, dressed in the same Beatles t-shirt because he had not yet checked his luggage and found, in that fact, something faintly clarifying. The board, which had spent the better part of a decade being grateful for Fred Okafor's majority shareholding and its stabilizing effect on their stock price, was extremely supportive of his handling of the situation and extremely interested in making that support very publicly visible. Fred appreciated their position and said so. He also told them what he intended to do next, and he watched their faces move through the specific sequence of expressions that boardroom faces move through when a proposal is both excellent and unexpected: surprise, rapid calculation, recalibration, and then the particular species of enthusiasm that occurs when powerful people realize they can be on the right side of a story that is already being written without them. He told them he wanted to build something, not a task force, not a sensitivity training program of the kind that generated good headlines for 6 months and then dissolved into the institutional atmosphere like so much perfume. Something with structure, something with teeth. Something that would outlast the news cycle and the commentary and the 17 platform replays and mean something 5 years from now to a person who had never heard of Fred Okafor and never watched the video. He called it the Fly Equal Initiative. The name had come to him at 30,000 feet, somewhere over the Nevada desert, in the margins of his journal. The initiative had 3 components. The first was a mandatory bias audit for all passenger-facing crew. Not a one-time certification, but a rolling assessment, annually renewed, tied to continued employment. The second was a passenger advocacy protocol, a formalized mechanism by which any passenger who experienced discriminatory treatment could report it directly to an independent ombudsman whose office sat outside the normal management chain and reported directly to the board. The third was a transparency requirement, annual public reporting of bias-related incidents, complaints, resolutions, and outcomes, audited by an independent third party and published without redaction on the Swift Air's website. Fred presented the initiative to the board in 40 minutes. The board approved it in 12. The initiative was launched publicly the following Monday. Within 30 days, 4 other North American carriers had contacted Swift Air's legal team asking about adoption. Within 90 days, the initiative framework had been formally adopted by 7 carriers. Within 6 months, 11 had signed on, with 3 international airlines in active discussions. The aviation industry, which had been looking for a framework and had not found one, discovered that Fred Okafor had built one, as he tended to build things, precisely, completely, and in the space of time that other people were still deciding whether building was necessary. 6 months after Flight SA-114, Fred boarded a Swift Air's first-class cabin for the California route again. Same gate, same seat, same route, entirely different afternoon. The crew member who greeted him at the door said, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Okafor. Seat 1A, same as always. Still water." "Please," Fred said. He settled into the seat. The leather was the right temperature. The California Business Review was on the tray table. His water arrived in the correct glass before the boarding was complete. He opened his journal, a new one, the old one long since filed as evidence in the employment appeals process, and he wrote the date and the flight number. He had received, in the past 6 months, a volume of correspondence that would have been impossible to answer personally, and that he had answered personally anyway, working through it in the early mornings and the late nights, because the letters were not, he felt, the kind of thing that should be answered by an assistant or a form response. They were letters from people who had watched a video and recognized something in it that belonged to them. They were letters from flight attendants who wanted him to know they had been trying to report conduct exactly like that for years and hadn't known where to take it. From pilots who were ashamed of what they'd seen and said so plainly. From passengers who had stepped off planes and swallowed what had happened to them because the alternative seemed too large and too unlikely to bother with. And from travelers, working people, business people, people who flew every week for jobs that paid for the houses their families lived in, who wrote to say that they used to pre-apologize to the crew. They used to make themselves smaller before the flight began, redistributing themselves toward the edges of their legitimacy before anyone had said a word, because experience had taught them that this was the price of admission to spaces that had not yet decided to believe in their right to be there. One of those letters was from a woman in her 30s who worked in pharmaceutical sales and flew every Monday and Friday of her adult professional life. She had written, "Before your flight, every time I walked up to first class, one felt like I was wearing a sign that said, 'Prove it.' Like the seat wasn't really mine until I'd convinced someone. I didn't even realize I felt that way until I watched your video and understood that I wasn't imagining it, that it was real, and that it could be answered." Fred read that letter 3 times. He kept it in his jacket pocket, not in a file, not in a folder, but in the pocket over his chest, because it seemed like the right place for it. He thought about it now, in seat 1A, as the cabin filled around him and the California sun slanted through the windows at the same flat gold angle it always did at this hour. He thought about the 14 audits before this one, all the quiet afternoons of observation and note-taking, all the protocol adjustments and service overhauls generated from a leather journal, all the invisible, methodical work of building a company that was worth something. Not just profitable, but worth something in the way that people use that phrase when they mean it properly. He thought about what it had cost him to sit still for 15 minutes. He knew that some people, watching the video, had questioned why he waited, why he didn't identify himself immediately, why he endured what he endured before producing the credentials that ended it. He understood the question. He had asked himself a version of it across long nights in the months that followed. The answer was this. He had waited because he had wanted to know what happened. He had wanted the record to be complete. Not just his word against theirs, not just a dispute about a seat, but a full and documented account of what this airline, his airline, the company he had built and invested 20 years of his life in, looked like from the inside when no one important was watching. He had wanted the data. He had always wanted the data. And the data had been devastating. And it had been exactly what he needed to build something better. The jet bridge detached. The engines found their register. Fred opened his journal and looked at the first line on the fresh white page. The date and the flight number, written in his precise, unhurried hand. And below it he began to write a new note. Not about a service deviation or a protocol breach. Not about a confrontation or a correction. Just about an afternoon in a first-class cabin and the work that had come from it, and what a company could look like when the distance between what it claimed to be and what it actually was had been reduced. Not to nothing, because nothing is never entirely the destination, but to something much, much smaller. Below him, the runway blurred and fell away. The aircraft lifted into the California sky with the smooth, unhurried authority of a well-maintained machine that knows exactly where it's going. Fred Okafor kept writing. The Fly Equal initiative was formally codified as an industry standard by the National Aviation Service Council 14 months after Fred Okafor grounded Flight SA 114. The appeals filed by Captain Gustin and Miss Karen were reviewed and rejected by the Swift Air's Independent Review Board. The video remains, as of the date of this story, one of the most viewed pieces of footage in the history of aviation journalism. Frederick Okafor continues to conduct passenger audits on Swift Air's flights. He is always dressed in civilian clothes. He is always in the seat he paid for. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, do subscribe to our channel because your support keeps the team going, and stick with us because we have many more where this came from. More intriguing and more amazing stories as you can ever imagine. So do check it out and enjoy.